Sarah Blake was no stranger to urban legends. As a journalist for a niche magazine specializing in debunking supernatural myths, she'd heard every bizarre story imaginable. But when a tip came in about Grayspire Hollow, her curiosity was piqued. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, the abandoned train station was said to be haunted by a ghostly locomotive. Locals claimed the train appeared on foggy nights, picking up passengers who were never seen again. Skepticism was her forte, and she planned to turn the tale into her next expose. The journey to Grayspire Hollow was arduous. The winding mountain roads were treacherous, and the dense forest seemed to press in on her car as if urging her to turn back. When she finally arrived, the station stood like a sentinel in the mist. Its weathered facade and boarded-up windows exuded an eerie charm. Vines crept along the walls, and the platform was covered in moss and debris. Despite its decay, there was something unsettlingly timeless about it. Sarah set up camp just beyond the platform, her tent positioned to give her a clear view of the tracks. She spent the first 2 nights pacing the grounds, her flashlight cutting through the fog, but found nothing out of the ordinary. She recorded the sounds of the forest, the creak of the station's old timbers, and the occasional rustle of animals. It was all explainable, all mundane. Yet, an undercurrent of unease tugged at her. On the 3rd night, just as she was preparing to pack up and declare the legend a hoax, she heard it, the faint, mournful wail of a train whistle. It was distant at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as it grew louder, the air seemed to thrum with energy. Sarah's pulse quickened. She grabbed her camera and sprinted toward the platform. Out of the mist, the train emerged. It was an impossibly old steam locomotive, its iron body gleaming as if untouched by time. The carriages glowed faintly, their windows shrouded in darkness. The air grew colder as the train slowed to a stop, its wheels screeching against the rusted tracks. The whistle blew again, a sound that seemed to reverberate in Sarah's bones. Despite her racing heart, she couldn't resist the pull. She stepped onto the platform, the camera shaking in her hands. The door of the nearest carriage creaked open, and without thinking, she climbed aboard. The interior of the train was both beautiful and unsettling. Plush velvet seats lined the carriages, their deep red fabric untouched by age. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, flickering glow. But the most striking feature was the passengers. They sat motionless, their forms shrouded in shadow. Sarah couldn't make out their faces. They seemed to flicker like static on a screen, their edges blurred. None of them acknowledged her presence. Their heads tilted slightly downward as if lost in thought. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the train's engine. Sarah moved cautiously through the carriage, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She tried to speak, but her voice came out in a whisper, swallowed by the heavy air. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" No one responded. The shadows didn't stir, and the train began to move. The sudden jolt nearly knocked her off her feet. She stumbled to a seat, clutching her camera like a talisman. As the train picked up speed, the windows revealed a landscape that defied explanation. The trees and mountains of Grayspire Hollow faded into a swirling mist, replaced by a barren expanse of cracked earth and an endless gray sky. Time felt distorted, each second stretching into an eternity. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the train was taking her somewhere far beyond the physical world. Sarah's panic subsided enough for her to think clearly. She needed answers. Moving to the next carriage, she found a small, ornate table with a ledger resting atop it. The pages were filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes. Some entries had been crossed out, while others were accompanied by phrases like unresolved or departed. She flipped to the most recent page and froze. Her name was there, written in neat cursive. Next to it was a single word: pending. A wave of cold washed over her. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Before she could process the implications, a figure appeared at the far end of the carriage. It was the conductor. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and expressionless. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes, black and empty, bore into her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He gestured for her to follow, his movements slow and deliberate. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. "Where are we going?" Why am I here? The conductor didn't answer. He turned and began walking, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Sarah hesitated but felt an inexplicable compulsion to follow. He led her to a private compartment, its door marked with a symbol she didn't recognize. Inside was a single chair and a mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. "Sit," the conductor said, his voice low and hollow. Sarah obeyed, unable to resist. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and images began to form. She saw herself, younger and carefree, standing on the edge of a busy street. The scene shifted to a car speeding through a red light, a sickening thud, and a figure crumpling to the ground. Her reflection stared back at her, its eyes filled with guilt. She tried to look away, but the mirror held her gaze. The conductor's voice echoed in the room. "The train finds those with unfinished business. You carry the weight of your guilt. It has brought you here." The mirror faded, and Sarah was left staring at her own pale reflection. Memories she had long buried resurfaced, each one sharper than the last. The accident. The stranger's face. Her decision to flee the scene. It was a moment she had spent years trying to forget, but the train had dragged it into the light. The conductor watched her silently, his expression unreadable. "The passengers you see are like you. Souls bound by regret, unable to move on. The train offers a choice, redemption or eternal passage." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "You must confront your guilt," he replied. "Resolve what binds you, or join them in the shadows." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. She thought of the shadowy passengers, their silent forms a chilling reminder of what awaited her if she failed. But how could she redeem herself? The accident had been years ago. The victim was gone, and no amount of atonement could change the past. The conductor extended a hand, and the mirror rippled again. This time, it showed Grayspire Hollow and the station, bathed in the golden light of sunset. She saw herself standing on the platform, watching the train disappear into the mist. The image filled her with a sense of urgency. The answer lay in the station, in the mystery of the train itself. The train began to slow, its wheels screeching as it approached a station unlike the one she had boarded from. This platform was dark and foreboding, the air thick with despair. The conductor motioned for her to leave, but Sarah shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "I'm going back." The conductor's expression darkened. "You cannot undo what has been done. Your place is here." Sarah took a step back, clutching the ledger she had taken from the previous carriage. She opened it to her name and, with trembling hands, crossed it out. The moment the pen left the page, the train shuddered violently. "You dare defy the cycle," the conductor roared, his voice reverberating through the carriages. The shadows surged toward her, their forms twisting and writhing. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah shouted, "This ends now." She threw the ledger into the swirling shadows, its pages igniting in a brilliant blaze. The train shook, its walls splintering as light burst through the windows. When the chaos subsided, Sarah found herself back at Grayspire Hollow. The station was quiet, the mist lifting to reveal a clear night sky. The train was gone, and with it, the oppressive weight of her guilt. She felt lighter, as if a burden she had carried for years had finally been lifted. Sarah left the station, vowing to honor the life she had taken by living her own with purpose. She would tell the story of the vanishing train of Grayspire Hollow, not as a skeptic, but as someone who had faced its shadows and emerged whole. But deep in the mountains, the rails still gleamed in the moonlight, waiting for the next soul to board the train.